The night James and Thomas decided to leave behind the finest plantation in Virginia, they weren't running from poverty or hardship. They were walking away from what their enslavers called privilege, choosing the uncertainty of freedom over the gilded cage of bondage. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now, because this story will challenge everything you think you know about slavery, showing you that no amount of material comfort can replace the fundamental human need for freedom and self-determination. It was the autumn of 1800, and the Ashford plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of prime Virginia tobacco land, one of the wealthiest estates in the state. The main house was a mansion of white columns and crystal chandeliers, filled with imported furniture and fine art, a monument to the wealth built on the labor of more than 200 enslaved people. And among those enslaved people, James and Thomas occupied a unique position. They were house servants, trained from childhood to serve the Ashford family with skill and discretion, given responsibilities that other enslaved people never received, treated with what the Ashfords considered special favor. James was 28 years old, tall and dignified, with an intelligence that shone in his eyes despite his efforts to hide it. He had been trained as the personal valet to Charles Ashford, the plantation's owner, a position that required him to dress his enslaver each morning, attend to his needs throughout the day, and be available at all hours. He slept in a small room adjacent to the master bedroom, ate food from the main house kitchen, wore clothes that were finer than those of field workers, and was never subjected to the brutal physical labor that defined the lives of most enslaved people. Thomas was 25, James's younger brother by 3 years, and he served as the head butler, managing the household staff, overseeing the serving of meals, ensuring that the Ashford home ran with the precision and elegance that befitted their social status. He too lived in the main house, wore fine livery, and was treated with a degree of respect that was unusual for an enslaved person. The Ashfords often pointed to James and Thomas as examples of their benevolence, as proof that slavery could be humane, that enslaved people could be content and even grateful for their situation. But what the Ashfords didn't understand, what they could never understand because their entire worldview was built on the lie that some humans were meant to own others, was that James and Thomas were not grateful. They were not content. They were not the happy, loyal servants that the Ashfords imagined them to be. They were men who had learned to wear masks, to hide their true thoughts and feelings, to present the image their enslavers wanted to see while inside. They burned with the desire for freedom. The brothers had been born on the Ashford plantation, sons of a woman named Grace, who had been the head cook until her death 5 years earlier. Grace had been a woman of extraordinary strength and wisdom, who had taught her sons that survival under slavery required intelligence and strategy, that they must learn to navigate the system while never accepting it, that they must prepare themselves for the day when freedom might become possible. "You are not what they say you are," Grace had told her sons when they were young. "You are not property. You are not inferior. You are human beings, made in God's image, worthy of dignity and freedom. Never forget that, no matter what they tell you, no matter how they treat you. Keep your true self hidden and safe inside, where they cannot reach it. Learn everything you can. Observe everything. And when the time comes, be ready." Grace had died before she could see her sons free, but her words had shaped them, had given them the mental framework to survive bondage without being destroyed by it. And now, in the autumn of 1800, James and Thomas had decided that the time had come. They would escape, would claim the freedom that was their birthright, would honor their mother's memory by refusing to live and die as enslaved men. The decision had not been made lightly or quickly. For years, the brothers had debated whether escape was possible, whether the risks were worth taking, whether they should wait for a better opportunity. They had watched other enslaved people attempt escape and fail, had seen them captured and punished, had understood the terrible consequences of failure. But they had also gathered information, had learned about the growing network of people who helped runaways, had heard whispers of places in the north where black people could live free. What finally pushed them to act was the news that Charles Ashford was planning to sell Thomas. Despite all the talk of benevolence and special treatment, despite the Ashfords' claims that they treated their enslaved people like family, the economic reality was that enslaved people were property, and property could be sold when convenient or profitable. Ashford had gambling debts, and selling Thomas, a skilled butler who would command a high price, was an easy way to raise cash. When James learned of this plan, he knew they could wait no longer. The brothers had always sworn they would stay together, would escape together, or not at all. The threat of separation made immediate action necessary, regardless of the risks. And so they began to finalize their plans, to prepare for the escape they had been contemplating for years. Their position as house servants gave them certain advantages that field workers didn't have. They had access to the main house, to information about the family's schedules and plans. They could read. Grace had taught them in secret, using the family Bible, and they had access to newspapers and maps. They knew which roads led north, which towns were sympathetic to runaways, which areas were heavily patrolled. They had saved small amounts of money over the years, tips from guests and small payments for extra services, amounts that seemed insignificant, but that accumulated over time into a sum that might sustain them during their journey. But they also faced unique challenges. As house servants, they were more visible than field workers, more likely to be recognized if seen away from the plantation. Their fine clothes, their educated manner of speaking, their bearing, all of these marked them as unusual, as people who would attract attention. They would need to change their appearance, to adopt different personas, to become invisible in a society that was always watching for runaways. The brothers spent weeks preparing, gathering supplies in secret, hiding food and clothing in predetermined locations, memorizing routes and safe houses. They studied the patterns of the patrols, learned which nights were darkest, which weather conditions would favor their escape. They said quiet goodbyes to the few people they trusted, though they couldn't reveal their plans, couldn't risk word getting back to the Ashfords. And then, on a moonless night in October, they made their move. The Ashford family was hosting a large party, the kind of elaborate social event that required all the house servants to work late into the night. James and Thomas served the guests with their usual efficiency and discretion, showing no sign of the tension they felt, the knowledge that this was the last time they would ever serve the Ashford family, the last time they would play the role of obedient servants. When the party finally ended and the guests departed, when the family retired to their rooms and the house grew quiet, James and Thomas slipped away. They changed out of their livery into rough work clothes they had hidden, clothes that would make them less conspicuous. They took the supplies they had cached, food, water, a small amount of money, a knife for protection. And they walked out of the main house, across the lawn, past the slave quarters where others slept, and into the forest that bordered the plantation. The first hours of their escape were terrifying. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow seemed to hide a threat. They expected at any moment to hear shouts, to see torches, to be discovered and captured before they had even truly begun. But the night remained quiet, and they moved steadily north, following the route they had memorized, putting distance between themselves and the plantation. By dawn, they had covered perhaps 12 miles, and they found a hiding place in a dense thicket where they could rest during the day. They were exhausted, running on adrenaline and determination, but they couldn't sleep, couldn't relax their vigilance. They took turns keeping watch, listening for any sign of pursuit, ready to run at the first indication of danger. As the day passed and no pursuit materialized, they began to hope that their absence had not yet been discovered, that they had gained precious hours of head start. But they also knew that once their escape was known, the response would be swift and intense. The Ashfords were wealthy and influential, with connections throughout Virginia. They would offer substantial rewards for the brothers' capture, would mobilize slave catchers and patrols, would use every resource at their disposal to reclaim their property. That night, They continued their journey, moving through the forest, avoiding roads and towns, staying in the wilderness where they were less likely to be spotted. They traveled in silence, communicating with gestures and whispers, conserving their energy, maintaining their focus. The journey ahead was long, hundreds of miles to Pennsylvania, the nearest free state, and they knew they had to pace themselves, had to survive not just days, but weeks of constant danger and hardship. On the third night, they encountered their first real test. They heard dogs in the distance, the unmistakable sound of tracking hounds. The Ashfords had discovered their escape and had sent slave catchers after them. James and Thomas immediately implemented the plan they had discussed. They split up, each taking a different route, intending to confuse the dogs and then reunite at a predetermined location. James headed toward a river they had identified on their mental map, knowing that water would break his scent trail. He waded into the cold current, feeling it pull at his legs, and walked upstream for nearly a mile before crossing to the other side. The sound of the dogs grew fainter, and he allowed himself to hope that the strategy had worked. Thomas took a different route, moving through a swamp where the wet ground and thick vegetation would make tracking difficult. He moved carefully, testing each step, aware that one wrong move could trap him in mud or quicksand. The dogs' barking echoed through the night, sometimes seeming closer, sometimes farther away, and Thomas focused on moving steadily, on not panicking, on trusting in the plan. They reunited at dawn, at a distinctive rock formation they had memorized, both exhausted but relieved to see each other, to know that they had both evaded the dogs. But they also knew that this was just the first of many close calls, that the journey ahead would test them again and again, that survival would require constant vigilance and quick thinking. Over the next 2 weeks, James and Thomas traveled more than 200 miles, moving only at night, hiding during the day, living on the supplies they had cached and whatever they could forage from the forest. They grew gaunt and exhausted, their bodies pushed to the limits of endurance, but their determination never wavered. They were driven by something stronger than physical comfort, something more powerful than fear, the fundamental human need for freedom, for self-determination, for the right to live as they chose rather than as others dictated. They crossed from Virginia into Maryland, and the landscape changed. More towns, more roads, more people. This brought new dangers but also new opportunities. In Maryland, they made contact with the Underground Railroad, connecting with a free black woman named Sarah who operated a safe house. Sarah provided them with food, shelter for a day, and crucial information about the route ahead. "You're doing well," Sarah told them, her voice warm with approval. "Many don't make it this far, but the hardest part is still ahead. Maryland is a slave state and the patrols are active. You'll need to be even more careful as you approach Pennsylvania. The border region is heavily watched." She gave them directions to the next safe house, taught them the signals and passwords that would identify them as freedom seekers to those who could help, and sent them on their way with her blessing. "You carry the hopes of all of us," she said. "Every person who makes it to freedom proves that it can be done, gives hope to those still in bondage. Go with God, and may you find the freedom you seek." The brothers continued their journey, now part of the network of the Underground Railroad, moving from safe house to safe house, receiving help from both black and white abolitionists who risked their own safety to assist runaways. They met Quakers who sheltered them in hidden rooms, free black people who shared their meager resources, former slaves who had achieved freedom and now dedicated themselves to helping others. Each person they met reinforced their understanding that they were not alone in their struggle, that there was a community of people committed to ending slavery, that their escape was part of a larger movement for liberation. This knowledge sustained them through the hardest moments, reminded them that their individual journey was connected to something larger, that they were part of a great wave of resistance that would eventually sweep away the institution of slavery. The climax of their journey came at the border between Maryland and Pennsylvania. They had traveled for nearly 4 weeks, had covered more than 300 miles, and they were finally approaching free soil. But the border region was the most dangerous part of the journey, heavily patrolled by slave catchers who knew that this was where runaways would try to cross, who watched the roads and rivers, who questioned anyone who looked suspicious. James and Thomas approached the border with extreme caution, moving slowly, observing the patrol patterns, waiting for the right moment to cross. They had been directed to a specific crossing point by their last conductor, a place where the border followed a small stream and where the patrols were less frequent. But as they approached this crossing point, they saw slave catchers, 3 men on horseback, armed and alert, clearly watching for runaways. The brothers had to make a decision. They could wait, hoping the slave catchers would leave, but that might take hours or days, and they were running low on supplies and energy. Or they could try to find another crossing point, but that would mean traveling farther, exposing themselves to more danger, possibly missing their connection with the conductor who was supposed to meet them on the Pennsylvania side. James studied the situation, his mind working through the options, calculating risks and probabilities. "We can't wait," he whispered to Thomas. "We're too close. We need to cross now, while we still have the strength." Thomas nodded, trusting his brother's judgment. "How?" James pointed to a section of the stream that was hidden from the slave catcher's view by a bend and some overhanging trees. "There. We go into the water upstream, let the current carry us past them, then climb out on the Pennsylvania side. It's risky. If they hear us or see us, we're trapped in the water. But it's our best chance." They moved into position, waiting until the slave catchers were looking in another direction, then slipped into the cold water. The current was stronger than James had anticipated, pulling at them, threatening to sweep them downstream faster than they could control. They had to fight to stay together, to keep their heads above water, to move silently despite the effort required. As they floated past the slave catcher's position, James's foot struck a submerged rock, and he couldn't suppress a grunt of pain. One of the slave catcher's heads turned toward the sound, and for a terrible moment, James was certain they had been discovered. But then a bird called from the forest, and the slave catcher turned away, apparently deciding the sound had come from wildlife. The brothers continued downstream until they were well past the patrol, then struggled to the Pennsylvania bank, pulling themselves out of the water, collapsing on the ground, gasping for breath, hardly daring to believe that they had made it, that they were finally on free soil. They lay there for several minutes, too exhausted to move, letting the reality sink in. They were in Pennsylvania. They were in a free state. They were no longer fugitives in the eyes of the law, at least not in this state. They had escaped from the Ashford plantation, had traveled more than 300 miles, had evaded slave catchers and patrols, had survived 4 weeks of constant danger and hardship. They had done what they had set out to do, but even as relief flooded through them, they knew that their journey was not over. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that they could still be captured and returned to Virginia, even in a free state. They would need to continue north, to Canada if necessary, to find a place where they would be truly beyond the reach of those who claimed to own them. And they would need to build new lives, to find work and housing, to establish themselves as free men in a society that was often hostile to black people, whether free or enslaved. They were met at a predetermined location by a conductor named Joseph, a white Quaker who had been helping runaways for years. Joseph provided them with dry clothes, food, and shelter in his home, and he gave them crucial advice about how to navigate life as free black men in Pennsylvania. "The law says you're free here," Joseph told them, "but the reality is more complicated. There are people who will help you, but there are also people who will try to capture you for the reward money. You'll need to be careful, to stay vigilant, to build connections with the free black community who can protect and support you." He connected them with a community of free black people in Philadelphia, a thriving population of formerly enslaved people and those who had been born free, people who had created institutions and networks to support each other, to resist the ongoing oppression they faced, to work for the complete abolition of slavery. In Philadelphia, James and Thomas found a new home. They found work, James as a skilled craftsman, Thomas as a teacher in a school for black children. They found community, connecting with others who had escaped slavery, who understood what they had endured, who shared their commitment to working for liberation. They found purpose, becoming active in the abolitionist movement, speaking about their experiences, helping other runaways, working to end the institution that had claimed them as property. But they also found that freedom was more complex than they had imagined. They were free from the Ashfords, free from the immediate bondage of slavery, but they were not free from racism, from discrimination, from the ongoing effects of living in a society built on white supremacy. They faced hostility from white people who resented their presence, who believed that black people, even free black people, were inferior and should be subordinate. They faced economic discrimination, being denied opportunities because of their race. They faced the constant threat of kidnapping by slave catchers who didn't care whether their victims were legally free or not. And they carried with them the psychological scars of slavery, the trauma of years of bondage, the memories of humiliation and dehumanization. Freedom did not erase these experiences, did not heal these wounds overnight. It was a beginning, not an ending, the start of a long process of recovery and self-definition. James and Thomas also carried guilt about those they had left behind, the other enslaved people on the Ashford plantation, people they had known their entire lives, people who had not been able to escape, who continued to suffer in bondage. This guilt was a heavy burden, and it drove them to work even harder for abolition, to help as many people as possible escape, to use their freedom to fight for the freedom of others. Over the years, the brothers became respected members of the free black community in Philadelphia. James became known for his craftsmanship and his business acumen, eventually opening his own workshop and employing other free black people. Thomas became an influential educator and writer, publishing articles about slavery and freedom, teaching generations of black children, helping to build the institutions that would sustain the community. They both married and had children, raising families in freedom, giving their children opportunities that had been denied to them. They taught their children about their history, about the escape from the Ashford plantation, about the importance of freedom and the responsibility that came with it. They taught them that freedom was not just about individual liberty, but about collective liberation, that they had an obligation to use their freedom to work for justice, to fight against oppression in all its forms. The brothers never returned to Virginia, never saw the Ashford plantation again. But they learned through the network of formerly enslaved people that their escape had caused quite a stir. Charles Ashford had been outraged and humiliated that his most trusted servants had deceived him, had planned their escape while appearing to be loyal and content. He had spent considerable money trying to track them down, had offered large rewards for their capture, had refused to accept that they had outwitted him. But James and Thomas also learned that their escape had inspired others. Enslaved people on the Ashford plantation and neighboring plantations had heard the story of the brothers who had walked away from privilege to claim their freedom, and it had given them hope, had shown them that escape was possible even from the most closely watched situations, had demonstrated that no amount of material comfort could replace the fundamental human need for freedom. James and Thomas lived long lives, both surviving into their 70s, both witnessing the Civil War and the end of slavery. They saw the Emancipation Proclamation, saw the 13th Amendment abolish slavery throughout the United States, saw the institution that had claimed them as property finally destroyed. It was a moment of profound joy and vindication, the realization that their struggle had been part of a larger movement that had ultimately succeeded. But they also witnessed the rise of new forms of oppression after slavery ended, the black codes, the sharecropping system that was slavery by another name, the violence of the Ku Klux Klan, the systematic denial of civil rights to black people. They understood that the legal end of slavery was not the end of the struggle, that liberation was an ongoing process, that each generation would have to fight for freedom and equality in its own way. When James died in 1873, Thomas spoke at his funeral about the night they had walked away from the Ashford plantation, about the decision to choose freedom over comfort, about the courage it had taken to leave behind everything familiar and step into the unknown. "My brother taught me," Thomas said, "that freedom is not about material comfort or physical ease. It is about the right to determine one's own life, to make one's own choices, to live with dignity and self-respect. We could have stayed at the Ashford plantation, could have lived relatively comfortable lives as house servants, could have accepted the privileges they offered us. But we understood that those privileges were not freedom, that no amount of comfort could compensate for the fundamental injustice of being owned by another human being." Thomas lived another 10 years, and when he died in 1883, he was surrounded by children and grandchildren, by a community that honored his memory, by people who understood that his life had been a testament to the human spirit's refusal to accept bondage, to the power of choice even in the most constrained circumstances, to the truth that freedom is worth any sacrifice. The story of James and Thomas, the brothers who walked away from wealth to claim their freedom, became an important part of the oral history of the free black community in Philadelphia. It was told and retold, each telling emphasizing different aspects: the courage, the intelligence, the choice to value freedom over comfort, the understanding that material privilege could never replace human dignity. Their story challenges the narratives that were often used to justify slavery. The claims that enslaved people were content with their situation, that those who were treated well had no desire for freedom, that material comfort could compensate for the loss of liberty. James and Thomas's decision to escape from one of the wealthiest plantations in Virginia, where they held privileged positions and were treated with relative favor, demonstrated that the desire for freedom was fundamental and universal, that no amount of material comfort could satisfy the human need for self-determination and dignity. Their story also demonstrates the complexity of resistance under slavery. James and Thomas had to navigate a system that offered them certain privileges in exchange for compliance, that tried to co-opt them into identifying with their enslavers, that sought to create divisions between house servants and field workers. They had to maintain their commitment to freedom while accepting the privileges that came with their positions, had to use those privileges strategically while never losing sight of their ultimate goal. The brothers' escape also reveals the intelligence and strategic thinking required to successfully escape from slavery. They had to plan carefully, to gather information, to prepare mentally and physically, to choose the right moment, to navigate hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Their success was not a matter of luck, but of careful planning and execution, of intelligence and determination, of the ability to assess situations and make strategic decisions. If this story has moved you, if James and Thomas's choice to value freedom over comfort has inspired you, if you understand that true liberty cannot be replaced by material privilege, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. Share this video with everyone you know. Let the legacy of these brothers remind us that freedom is not about comfort or ease, but about dignity and self-determination, that no amount of privilege can compensate for the loss of liberty, that the human spirit will always choose freedom over bondage, no matter what the cost. Subscribe now and join us in honoring those who understood that freedom is worth any sacrifice, who chose the uncertainty of liberty over the certainty of comfortable bondage, who proved that the desire for freedom is fundamental to human nature and cannot be bought or suppressed.